Neither the circle without the line, nor the line without the point, can be artificially produced. It is therefore by virtue of the point and the monad that all things commence to emerge in principle. That which is affected at the periphery, however large it may be, cannot in any way lack the support of the central point. Hello, and in today's video we're going to look at the Dee Sanction, which is a game by the author of the Cthulhu Hack, which is a well-respected quick-playing Cthulhu game. And it's a game about the Tudors, in particular Queen Elizabeth I and John Dee. Now, if you order the Kickstarter, you've got these nice little extras, but what most people will get hold of is either the plain old core rules or the PDF version of the core rules. You can also order some nice dry erase rule sets as well. Now, obviously, in theory, these two rule books are the same, and this rather Spartan-looking black hardback has a wonderful gold leaf on the cover, but the interior is pretty much the same as the paperback and the PDF version. Now, I've had a quick skim of the rules, and I'm very, very impressed with the way that they've managed to create a Tudor sort of, I guess, slight fantasy witchcraft occult game. And having studied a little bit about the Tudors and magic in the Renaissance era, this game really appealed to me just from the sheer setting, let alone the rules. Now, the rules are sort of interesting because your character only has 3 stats. So you've got intellectual, physical, and supernatural. You'll have an occupation and a background which will build your expertise and abilities, and you'll get a fortune token for special effects. You'll have some mundane possessions, which could include armour, and then as a group you'll have tradecraft, which is a sort of an overall sort of skill resource you can call on. I believe you can only take 3 hits and then you're down. And then you've got affiliations or contacts, and then favours, and then you've got an unravelling, which is where I guess you sort of lose your sanity and get possessed and stuff like that. Now, the actual rules themselves, fairly short, of around 60 pages. 68 according to the contents here, and it's got these rather wonderful sort of line art that evokes the sort of Renaissance era artwork of the time. Now, the setting is, as I say, based in the Tudor era, and it comes after the actual historical act against conjurations, enchantments and witchcraft in 1563, and there's various other books published around this time to do with witchcraft. But the conceit in this game is that Dee and Walshingham have got together to create like a special secret society to protect the Queen from Catholic incursions and magic wielding people. And of course Dee was all for this because it also meant that he could pursue his magical crafts safe from persecution. So we've got a little bit of background here. We've then got a brief John Dee timeline, which is a mix of historical fact and I believe conceits for the purposes of the game. And what is the game? Well, it's talking about a version of history where magic exists, and with it the possibility of angels and obviously demons and witches and stuff like that. So it isn't about historical pedantry, so don't worry if you're not that au fait with the historical period, and it's not about anything that, you know, you particularly object to. So it does use, in theory, D4 to D12, but you're probably not going to need all of those dice right at the start. And you are not heroes. You are sort of, I guess, convicted criminals who've been rescued from death, a bit like Suicide Squad, to work for Dee and Walshingham to basically, you know, absolve your sins. So you are vulnerable, expendable, amateurs, and only slightly supernatural, but you're definitely criminals, death marked. You're beneath most of polite society, you're conflicted, you're mostly in the dark, and you're convenient scapegoats. So sets you up nicely. So short Tudor history, couple of pages on that. And then we get into the becoming an agent of D. So you've got your 3 resources, as I said, your physical, your intellectual, and your supernatural, and it gives you a description of what they do. Now you've got 6 dice steps, and using this little table here, you can assign a D4, a D6, a D8, a D10, or a D12. However, if you assign a D12, that's going to use up 5 of your dice steps and not leave you much else for anything else. So yeah, that's not really likely to happen. So you could do a D10 and 2 D4s, or you could do 3 D6s. So there's all sorts of weird and wonderful mixes you can do there. Now, one thing I would criticise this rulebook about is it sort of jumps around a bit. So on here, we've got a sort of the page number. So 11, 12, but then it jumps to 20. So where's 13? Oh, that's up here. So it doesn't flow in quite such a nice way as, for example, the Mothership character sheet does, but it's not a big problem. Now, the other problem is here, it talks about backstory and it talks about cards, although you can also, in theory, use dice, but I think it works better with the cards by the looks of it. And the other problem I have with it is that when you're doing your backstory, you jump forward or deeper into the rulebook, I should say, for example, to pick an occupation. And that will give you a list of potential abilities. However, when it actually comes to picking your abilities, you can only take a few of them. So I would recommend, if you get the rulebook, to make sure you read through it, because if you just follow it sequentially, it can be a bit confusing. And it is a shame that you have to sort of flick deeper into the rulebook, then flip back on occasions. But it's not a big deal, so don't worry about it too much. So you get your backstory, where you've got an occupation and association. You then get favours of the angels. So a favour is a little 1d4 and 1d10, or use a deck to select that. And it's an angelic mark, which is a basic form of influence that you can get and might get you out of a tiny scrape. So you then go through here, and you then, as I said, I think it's 3. Yeah, choose 3 of the 8 abilities that you would have got via your backstory. Then you've got your hits and your unravelling. So you lose hits when you wave it in the face of a threat or a hazard. And an agent's personality consists of a balance of their humours, which is a very Renaissance idea. And this is illustrated by your unravelling. And there's a bit more information about that on page 22. So you get 3 hits and a basic D8 unravelling. Now, obviously, as you get more sort of unhinged, you might find that D8 bumps down to D6 or D4. Maybe it goes the opposite way and you become hardened to the perils of the world. Now, fortune is basically a token that you can re-roll a dice with, and it basically is a one and done per adventure device. So if you're playing an adventure that lasts 4 or 5 sessions, if you use it in the first session, you're going to have to wait a long time before you get that token back. And then you've got some resources and allies. Again, you go off to a table for that. And then tradecraft is the bit that I guess is a little bit odd. So each adventure you pick some tradecrafts to have to call on. So, they're not desperately useful, but occasionally they can be helpful. So as a group, you decide what your tradecraft is. So the team must choose one tradecraft after being briefed on missions nature. So you're going to go to France and you're going to steal a saintly relic. Which tradecraft do you want for that? And then you pick that. So we've got a load of stuff about that. And then it actually talks about the ways and means of tradecraft. So access summarises the people, groups and associations known to the agents. Conspiracy represents the agency in action that questions both the status quo and common sense. Kit outlines the agent's preparedness, possessing the right piece of mundane equipment, clothing, etc. Magic frames the agent's immersion in the periphery of the other world, so the occult. Given the attitude across Europe to witchcraft, recognition or confession of a knowledge of magic is tantamount to signing your own death warrant. You've got to be a bit careful. System describes an agent's familiarity with the pulleys and levers required to sidestep the law, accelerate bureaucracy, and bullseye the loopholes in European establishment and officialdom. And then vigilance is betraying a flair for watchfulness, curiosity, and causation, the gift of a well-timed revelation that puts an adversary off guard. We then get to the table of occupation, so doctor, unperson, barber surgeon, waterman, etc. Then association, so you could be part of the Star of Artemis, the Pythagorean Brotherhood, the Druids of the Eternal Grove. So it gives you a description. So if we go with the Druids, ancient order seeking to revive the Druidic faith of Celtic legend and restore balance to the world. And this will give you the abilities of natural history, folklore, and quieting the common beast. And let's say you're a gardener, hardworking keepers of small plots, you'll have foraging, labouring, and beekeeping. So out of those 6 there, you would pick your 3. So you've then got focus. So maybe you are part of the Liber Salomonis. So ceremonial traditions incorporated in the wisdom of King Solomon, and that will give you purification and detect lies as your abilities. So that gives you your 8 abilities, which you then narrow down to 3. So we've got the favours here, and you can either draw cards or a D4 for the columns and a D10 for the rows. And let's say you get catch. So this is inflame, kindle and smoke. Alternatively, if you've got frost, slide, slip or obscure. So they're sort of like almost like magical effects. Then we get to the heart of the game. So you're trying to, go through stuff and deal with challenges. So what's the positive and negative outcomes, i.e. the consequences? What are the resources? Calculate any advantage or disadvantage. Roll the dice and see if you succeed, basically. In a fight, you could falter and you could find yourself badly injured and eventually die. And then there's also the concept of stepping up and stepping down your dice. So a D4 can step up to a D6, or a D8 could step down to a D6, for example. So you've got a bit about threats, the order of bloodshed. So you check initiative, you state your goal, you resolve your attacks, and then you handle any damage. And it talks about initiative, goals, resolving your attacks, all or nothing defense, fighting unarmed, handling damage, resistance from armor, for example. And on 0 hits you are dying, and you will automatically die unless someone comes to your aid. And when you're out of action, you can be stunned, senseless, fragile, overcome, wasted or blood soaked. You can rest to recover some hits, but then there's consequences. So lingering physical consequence, lingering intellectual or supernatural consequence, and a situational consequence. So like, maybe you're going to be flanked or something similar. So the nature of the enemy, so you've got name, hits, resistances, and that's quite a complex little section there. So an angry mob, for example, has 1d4 plus 2 hits, 1d8 with a card or dice reaction on a d8, overwhelm, and a description of what they are. So as you can see, although the rules are quite simple, I found it quite a hard book to sort of get into and understand. Now, the unravelling is something that I do quite like. So the power of faith is real and struggling. Catholicism is under fire and Protestant reform called it into question. And the belief in the sanctity in the body of Christ and all that is at risk. So this can lead to unravelling. So there's the wild hunt. And unravelling measures these changes on ordinary people like the agents. And it's a trauma. So handling the unravelling. So when you confront an inhuman horror of the supernatural, they roll their unravelling die. And if the roll falters, then the die steps down. And as it drops, you get a shift in their humours. Now the humours are phlegm, black bile, yellow bile and blood. And there's a consequence that will happen if one of those is impacted. We then get into sort of spells. We then get into enemies of Elizabeth. So for example, the Pope, Mary Queen of Scots, King Philip of Spain, the Fae of the Great Wood, and practitioners of the night, which is a bunch of evil astronomers potentially. And one of them is in this game Sir Walter Raleigh, for example. You then got a bit about the Tudor age. You then get into some GM tools, and we've got complex consequences, resolving hazards, there's quite a bit in there, how to run the game, keeping journals, converting existing adventures, converting monsters, and then some really nice references. So one of the things it refers to, which is quite a good idea, is obviously historical documents, including, for example, the discovery of Witchcraft. But we've also got a Discovery of Witches Season 2, which is a very interesting programme which has been set in the Tudor period. We've then got an adventure, which I'm going to skip through to avoid too many spoilers for people. There you go. So we then got some random possessions, manners and mannerisms, some random names, and then we get into a little sort of monster catalogue again with these nice funky woodcut style artwork. So you got the Willow Smith, goblins, hags, mares, the boneless. We then got a glossary of terms, and then the patrons of Dee, which are the various backers of the Kickstarter. So I think the setting is brilliant, and I think the basic rules are pretty good, but as a rulebook, as I said, I found this a little bit impenetrable, and I've been flipping through my PDF copy trying to make sense of it whilst waiting for these rules to actually turn up. And they're nice and small, and in theory nice and simple, but as I say, the way they've been laid out, I actually found a little bit opaque for me. So that's my only criticism, is that I feel you have to really read the rulebook from cover to cover, jotting down some notes, and then it would all click and you'll think, well, I don't know why I was worried, it's actually pretty simple. Because basically, is it an intellectual, a physical or a supernatural talent, and you get some help from one of your abilities or your tradecraft. So at its core, it's a pretty simple game. So I'm very pleased to have got that. And now, the first one is obviously the neoprene dice rolling sort of pocket thing. So you just clip the corners together, and you've now got a little bowl to roll your dice in, which is keyed to obviously the Dee Sanction sort of look and feel. And yeah, it's a nice little easy to transport doobry, and it's a little bit thinner than I was expecting, but makes it nice and light and easy to transport. You've then got this rather fancy dice roll bag, and ooh, there you go. So it's really fancy pants. It rolls out. You've got a little Velcro pocket here, some little insert pockets and a little tab there. Really, really nice quality thing, and looks great. And obviously you can expand and contract it depending on how full it is. Branded by All Rolled Up, and with a nice Dee Sanction sort of bit glued on as well. Yeah, nice little touches. I don't think you need them for the game, but you know, very nice to have. So that was the square tray and the Agent of Dee Kickstarter exclusive All Rolled Up game roll dice bag. Well, to conclude then, what's my overall impression of the game? As I mentioned a few times already, the setting is fantastic. The Tudor era is really rich. I could actually see pushing this game back to the first Henry, to the founding of the Tudors and his battle to wrest control, and then you could bring it all the way up to the post-Tudor era, even, you know, doing the unification of Scotland and England with the Stuart line, particularly as the King, James, actually wrote a book on witchcraft, and so it's a really ripe setting. And as I say, once you get your head around the rules, I think they actually flow pretty simply. But that's something I am still struggling with, and that's my only criticism, is I think the flow of the rule book doesn't ease you in quite as much as I thought it would. And yeah, that's a bit of a disappointment. But as I say, that's a very personal thing. Some people will find these rules easy to follow. But when I'm having to flip backwards and forwards between pages, like it's saying, oh, well, you get these abilities, so you then jump forward to check what the abilities are, and then you flip back. When you're new to the game, that's not ideal. However, once you're used to the game, you know you're only going to get to pick 3 abilities, so you go through, right, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, okay, right, let's go to that page, generate those, pick your 3, right, there you go, character done. So it's really a very, very minor criticism of what is overall an excellent product. Now, do you need all these different copies that I got via the Kickstarter? No, I think this copy is perfectly fine. And because it's quite a small book, you can quite easily print it off and staple it on a A4 piece of paper. So to save yourself a bit of money. You might want to buy the PDF, but obviously if you want to support the company, buy their actual printed copy, unless of course he comments and tells us that he makes more money on the PDF, in which case buy the PDF. But the setting's brilliant. It's got pretty simple mechanics really, and there's pretty much everything you need in here. Obviously you then have to go off and create your own adventures, but this is a real callback to the classic era of role-playing where everything you needed was in a little book, and it was down to you as a group to create the adventure and the hours of excitement. So I'm really looking forward to my brain locking into this rule set and giving it a go. And if the worst comes to the worst, I'm going to pinch this setting to use with another set of rules, because I think the Dee Sanction's a fantastic idea of taking an actual historical figure, twisting him a bit into a really cool sort of magical, weird, almost Call of Cthulhu Tudor edition, I suppose, but that's maybe pushing it a bit too far. So anyway, I'm really looking forward to getting this one to the table. So there you go. I think that will do for this video. So until the next one, happy gaming.